was wondering if you could define imperialism for us, because to speak perfectly frankly, in an age when the United States stumbles along at 2.5% growth, and India races along at 10% growth, it doesn't feel, at least to your average American,
Very good.
that the structures of imperialism still affect the Indian-American relationship.
That's a great question, and it's a good thing because I'm writing a book about this now called The Poorer Nations: A Possible History of the Global South, and it'll come out early next year. It's a follow-up from my work on the Third World, and it starts in 1973. And what I'm interested in is actually saying maybe there's no India and there's no America. When you say India has a growth rate of 9%, what are we talking about? What is America at 2%? So let's start there. Now, after 73, the way my analysis is moving, and I've written 3 chapters of 4. So right now I'm at the BRIC chapter, which is why this is a great question for me now. Yeah, exactly. So what happens is that you get this very unstable equilibrium. Capitalism is typically a turbulent process. So you get a problem with where there's, let me put it this way. Firms, I'm going to do like a basic thing. So here we go. Firms basically produce for profit. Nobody says, I want to make toothpaste because I've always wanted to make toothpaste. Some people may say that, but what makes firms all the same, what unites firms, is that they basically all work for profit. Now, there may be a firm which is working for profit, but Tom really wants to make toothpaste. Okay? That may be. But they also are working for profit. Profit is what unites firms, the activity of firms. So if they are working for profit, one of the ways, the great engine of profit, and that's the dynamism of capitalism, is to create new technologies so that you can then have a productivity edge among your competitors. But that edge is very short-lived. Competitors catch up, even out, and then there's another breakthrough. Schumpeter, Polanyi has written some of this stuff, right? You keep seeking breakthroughs. What that does is it ends up in cycles of massive overcapacity, where firms are producing way more than effective demand is available. So for instance, firms want to produce for a profit, so they're trying to suppress collectively the wage packet of workers. As they move to productivity, they bring more technology into the shop floor. That means you can have less and less workers making more and more stuff. So in terms of the population, you have sections of the population that are either underemployed or unemployed, or getting less money. So effective demand is much less than the capacity of goods. That's the big gap that capitalism has to keep managing. What typically happens is you manage that gap by 2 processes. One is advertising. So you create desire among the population for things they may not need. And the second is you create credit markets. You produce credit. So somebody is creating huge surpluses, which they then lend to the population, sometimes generously, sometimes on outrageous, usurious interest rates. And then they come and buy this surplus stuff, which they desire from advertising. Now, what has occurred is, after the 1970s, when there was turbulence in the system, and when all these kinds of, this kind of process of overcapacity, went haywire, firms were unleashed. I mean, globalization was an answer. Globalization wasn't a natural process. Globalization is an ancient thing. But this globalization was an answer to the problem of containers. The United States container had to be opened so that firms could disarticulate production to low-wage centers. What you have today is you have a global market of labor, but with differential subsistence rates. So that in America, to subsist, you need to earn this much, and in India, to subsist, you need this much. So a firm is released to go and hire people at this subsistence rate. So there is no effective global subsistence rate. There are national subsistence rates, and firms can take advantage of that. We call that politely in economics arbitrage. Okay, they can do labor arbitrage. They go from one place to the other. What's happening is that these big firms, which are rooted in the north largely, have been making massive profits, producing in the south. So it creates an illusion that, say, China has a runaway growth rate. But what is China? What is Shenzhen? Shenzhen is a special processing country, basically, where there are firms in joint venture with the Chinese government producing massive amounts of goods for which over the last 10 years, they've found markets and then accumulated vast surpluses, which they lent back to places like the United States, where there's no productive capacity, to create the effective demand so that this crazy machine can keep going. So China has a 10% growth rate, but what is China? China has higher Gini coefficients now than it had 25 years ago. So the Chinese population cannot afford to buy the stuff that's produced in Shenzhen. There's no China market. There's no effective China market. What is the BRIC country? Brazil is steaming along. Why? Because commodity prices are high. They are largely selling raw materials. So what is imperialism? Imperialism is not the same as imperialism before 1973. But it's imperialism nonetheless. It's never the case that the central country in an empire benefits everybody in the empire. It's always been the case that certain classes inside the core benefit. Now those classes are mobile. And they are unwilling to allow themselves to be taxed, to pay for infrastructure and the creation of effective demand in our society. So we feel like we are in, what Arianna Huffington bizarrely called Third World America. We feel like that. But in fact, there is a section of this population which is linked to sections of other populations around the world that is doing better than ever. And they are untethered from social commitments. And that's the genius of 21st century imperialism. That it's not necessarily confined by the container of the nation state. There is no nation state for them. There is the nation state for the rest of us. Because we are contained within subsistence levels in our container. And that, I guess, is the tragedy of 21st century imperialism. That was a short course. Shall we?